Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. This time we're going to be tackling politics, but not in the usual way. You've all been following the current political scene, right? And you sent over this really interesting article called Lessons from History, Understanding Today's Political Climate.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah, it's by Allison Rowe 569 at gmail.com, published on March 3rd, 2025, just last week, on the site roamingaround.com. And our mission today is to basically see how we can use the past to help make sense of what's going on in politics right now, like holding up history as a kind of magnifying glass to see the present more clearly.
I like that idea. I mean, there's a reason why people say history repeats itself, right? Not that things happen exactly the same way, but there are definitely these kind of patterns and trends that keep popping up throughout human history, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And this article is full of these aha moments. We're talking about revolutions that, in a way, are still happening today. The surprising connection between a peace treaty from, like, centuries ago and how countries get along today, and how social media, for all its craziness, is really just the latest way that media influences politics.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's like history isn't just dates and names. It's these dynamics and patterns that are always kind of bubbling under the surface of society.
Right. It's not about memorizing facts for a test. It's about understanding why people do the things they do, what ideas drive them, and how those things can, echo through time and affect us today.
Yeah, and a great example of that the article brings up, too, is the French Revolution. Remember that whole thing about liberty, equality, fraternity? Those ideas are still totally relevant today, aren't they? Like, we see them in all sorts of movements, like the fight for civil rights, the push for democracy, even in those online communities that are trying to make the internet a fairer place.
It's like those French revolutionaries set something in motion that's still unfolding today. And the article really made me think about how problems like inequality and nationalism aren't really new. They're just echoes of the past, popping up again and again in different ways.
Exactly. It's those different forms that can sometimes throw us off, right? But if we can recognize the underlying patterns, the echoes, then we can start to understand why people are doing what they're doing in politics today and what might happen as a result.
So history gives us this context, this way of making sense of things that might otherwise seem totally random or chaotic. But what about those huge events that kind of changed the course of history? This article takes us through some of the big ones, World War II, the Cold War. But what's so cool is that it doesn't just list them. It really digs into why they still matter to us now in the 21st century, why they help us understand the political landscape we live in.
Totally. Like, take World War II. Obviously, it completely reshaped the world map and shifted who had power, but it also did so much more than that. I mean, it led to the creation of the United Nations, right? And whether you love it or hate it, the UN has shaped how countries interact with each other ever since.
Right. And speaking of consequences, the article talks about how the end of the Cold War, which at the time felt like this huge victory for democracy, actually had some, well, unexpected side effects. I mean, yeah, it did help spread democracy around the world, but it also created this power vacuum that led to new conflicts and problems. It makes you think, what will the long-term impacts of this stuff happening in politics right now be?
It's like a reminder that we're not just watching history happen, we're actually part of making it. What we do today is going to shape the world tomorrow, just like those who came before us shaped the world we live in now.
I never thought about it like that. Okay, so we've got these huge world-changing events, but there's also another layer to this whole politics thing, right? The ideas, the beliefs, the ideologies, as the article calls them, things like liberalism, conservatism, socialism, nationalism, all the isms. The article talks about all of them, but in a way that I found really interesting, not like a boring textbook.
Because it really emphasizes that these ideologies aren't just fixed. They change over time, they adapt, and understanding that evolution is key to figuring out how they influence us today.
Totally. Like the article pointed out that liberalism, with its focus on individual rights and freedom, came about as a reaction against those super powerful kings and queens from back in the day. The idea was to give power to the people, limit what the government could do, and protect individual freedoms. Pretty revolutionary at the time, right? And even though liberalism has branched out into all these different forms, that core idea is still super relevant to a lot of political movements today.
Absolutely. And then you've got conservatism, which people often think of as stuck in the past, but even conservatism has changed a lot. Now it often focuses on things like family values and protecting a country's independence issues that are really big in today's world, too.
So just knowing the dictionary definition of these ideologies isn't really enough, is it? We need to get the nuances, the historical context, the way they've changed over time. That's how we can really understand the political conversations happening all around us.
Yeah, and it helps us avoid getting stuck in those oversimplified labels that people throw around. It's about getting to the heart of what's driving these different political movements, both in the past and today.
Okay, so we've talked about these echoes of history, the way ideas evolve. But what about those times when, like, history throws us a curveball? When conflict happens and everything changes in the blink of an eye? The article says we can learn a lot from these political clashes, even those that seem like ancient history.
And it brings up a really interesting example. The Peace of Westphalia. I know it sounds super old school, but it was this treaty signed way back in 1648 that ended the 30 Years' War in Europe. But even more importantly, it introduced this idea of state sovereignty.
State sovereignty, what's that?
Basically, it means that each country has the right to govern itself without other countries butting in.
So something that happened over 350 years ago is still relevant today. That's kind of mind-blowing. But how?
Well, the Peace of Westphalia laid the foundation for how countries interact with each other today. It's the reason we have things like embassies and treaties and all those complicated rules about what countries can and can't do. Of course, the world is a lot more interconnected now than it was back then, but that whole idea of state sovereignty is still a big deal in global politics.
Wow, it's like this event from centuries ago set things in motion that led to the world we live in now. And speaking of echoes from the past, the article also talks about the American Civil War,
Whoa.
but not just as like a historical event. It uses it to show that if we don't deal with social injustices and deep divisions in society, things can go really, really bad.
Right. It's like a warning from history that pretending problems don't exist doesn't make them go away. And unfortunately, it seems like we haven't always learned that lesson.
It's pretty sobering to think about all the lives lost and the damage that the Civil War did to America. But the article connects this to the civil rights movements we've seen, more recently. It shows that the fight for justice and equality is something that's been going on for a long, long time, and it's still going on today.
And that brings us to the power of people coming together to make change happen. Those social movements. This article does such a good job of showing how ordinary people, when they unite for a common cause, can actually change the world.
Oh, yeah. I loved the section about the U.S. civil rights movement. It talks about how activists used all these different methods, peaceful protests, boycotts, going to court to fight for equality, and how they eventually achieved major victories like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's amazing to see how much they accomplished.
It's truly inspiring. And the article makes this connection between those historical movements and ones that are happening right now, like Black Lives Matter, the climate justice movement, even those online groups advocating for digital rights.
It's like they're all part of the same story, each generation building on the one before it. It makes you realize that we're not just stuck with the world as it is. Yeah. We can actually be part of changing it.
Exactly. And by learning about the strategies that worked in the past, and also the ones that didn't, we can become more effective at creating change today.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about something that sometimes gets left out when we talk about politics. Money, economics. The article gets into this whole complex relationship between economics and politics, and it uses a pretty dramatic example to make its point.
The Great Depression.
Bingo. The article says that the economic disaster of the 1930s wasn't just a financial thing. It also led to huge political changes all over the world. Like it sparked new ideologies, made governments more involved in the economy, and made people rethink the whole deal between citizens and their governments.
Yeah, in the U.S., the Great Depression led to Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, right? And that completely changed the role of government, like with creating social safety nets and regulating the economy. A lot of the social programs and regulations we have today are because of what happened back then.
And the article connects this to, more recent stuff, too, like the 2008 financial crisis. It points out that when the economy is a mess, people want change, which can lead to all sorts of political shifts. We saw this with the rise of those populist movements, the backlash against globalization, and that renewed focus on economic inequality.
It just shows you that when people feel like they're struggling financially, they're more likely to support anyone or anything that promises to shake things up, even if those promises might not actually work out so well in the long run.
So knowing the history of economic policies and political movements is really important for understanding what's happening in politics today, isn't it? It helps us see how the economy influences how people vote, what policies get made, and what people are even talking about when they talk about politics.
Absolutely. And it highlights how important it is to address economic inequality and support policies that make the economic system fairer and more sustainable. After all, you can't really have a healthy democracy without a healthy economy.
Okay, we've covered so much already. Revolutions, ideologies, conflict, social movements, economic crashes. I feel like we're hitting all the major points. But there's one more big piece of the puzzle we need to talk about: the media. The article takes us through this whole history of media and politics, starting with the early days of newspapers and going all the way to the digital world we live in now.
Yeah, it's a journey that shows how media influences not only what we know about politics, but also how politicians talk to us and even how we see the world around us. It's pretty powerful stuff.
Totally. The article starts by saying that even those early newspapers had a huge impact on public opinion. Like, it mentions how newspapers helped spread information and rally support for independence during the American Revolution. Imagine that. No Twitter, no 24-hour news channels. The power of the printed word must have been incredible back then.
It reminds us that people have always wanted to be in the know, to get the news and different perspectives on what's happening. And throughout history, there have always been new ways of getting that information, each with its own pros and cons.
And then came radio and television, right? The article talks about how these new technologies totally transformed politics. Like, it mentions those first televised presidential debates in 1960. People say that was a turning point because suddenly it wasn't just about what you said, but how you looked and how you came across on TV.
That's when we start seeing the rise of the celebrity politician, right? Someone who can really grab people's attention, seem confident, and connect with voters on an emotional level through television.
It's like politics became a performance almost. And then, fast forward to today, we have social media, which has completely changed the game again.
It's like this double-edged sword, isn't it? On one hand, it lets politicians talk directly to people, get messages out super fast, and organize movements in ways that were never possible before.
But on the other hand, the article talks about how social media is also this breeding ground for fake news, those echo chambers where people only hear what they already agree with, and just a crazy amount of division. Like, the 2016 U.S. election was a prime example of how social media can be used to manipulate people, spread propaganda, and even mess with democracy itself. It's kind of scary to think about.
It's definitely a complicated landscape, and it means we all have to be a lot more careful about what we see and believe online. We can't just take everything at face value anymore. We have to think critically, question things, and be aware of all the biases and agendas out there.
So social media is like this amazing tool for democracy, but it could also be a threat to democracy if we're not careful. It all comes down to how we use it, right?
Exactly. And it's something we all need to be thinking about and talking about. It's not just a problem for politicians or tech companies to solve. It's a challenge for all of us.
Okay, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've gone from revolutions to ideologies, economic crises, to the evolution of media. It feels like we've taken this whirlwind tour through the history of politics and how it shapes the world we live in.
It's fascinating to see how all these different pieces fit together, isn't it?
Absolutely. But I'm already thinking about how all of this connects to the political stuff that's happening right now. I'm ready to dive into that.
Me too.
Yeah.
That's where things get really interesting. It's like we've gathered all these pieces of the puzzle from history, and now we get to see how they help us understand the bigger picture of what's happening in the world today.
Okay, so we just went through a ton of historical moments, and I'm ready to see how all of this connects to the political stuff happening right now.
That's where it gets really interesting, right? It's like we've been putting together this puzzle of history, and now we can finally see how all the pieces fit to make the picture of our world today.
Exactly. And this article does such a good job of connecting those dots, showing these really thought-provoking parallels between what happened in the past and what's going on now.
Yeah, let's start with those recurring patterns in political movements. Throughout history, people have demanded change for all sorts of reasons: social justice, economic equality, political representation. But underneath it all, a lot of the motivations are actually pretty similar, wouldn't you say?
Oh, totally. Like, what kinds of motivations?
Well, think about it. People wanting a fairer and more just society, people rejecting systems that are oppressive, people wanting their voices to be heard and to have a say in how things are run. These are themes that pop up again and again throughout history.
It's amazing how, even though the details might be different, the core motivations behind these movements stay pretty consistent. It's like we're all part of this long struggle to make the world a better place.
Right. Like, think about the French Revolution, the American Civil Rights Movement, those Arab Spring uprisings. They happened in totally different places and times, but they were all driven by people demanding more freedom, more rights, and a fairer share of power. And when we recognize these patterns, it helps us understand what's driving political movements today.
It's like we're seeing those same motivations playing out right now with Black Lives Matter, the fight for climate justice, the push for LGBTQ plus rights. It's all connected in a way.
Exactly. Seeing those connections is key because it helps us understand that today's activism isn't just some random thing. It's part of this much bigger, longer story of how people fight for social and political change.
So it's not just about looking at individual events. It's about understanding those deeper forces that have been driving political change for, like, forever. I'm starting to get how history can help us make sense of all the crazy stuff happening in the world right now.
It's about connecting the dots and seeing the bigger picture, for sure. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about how understanding those political ideologies can help us understand all the political talk that's going on. You always hear those terms: liberal, conservative, socialist, nationalist, sometimes uses insults, sometimes use like they're the best thing ever.
Yeah, sometimes it feels like people are talking past each other, you know? Like they're using the same words, but they mean completely different things. It's confusing.
But if we understand where those ideologies came from, how they've evolved over time, then we can start to figure out the values and motivations behind those labels, right? And maybe then we can actually have conversations that make sense.
That makes sense. So, like, the article pointed out that liberalism, with its focus on individual rights and freedoms, well, that emerged as a response to those absolute monarchies back in the day, right? It was this radical idea of empowering people, limiting the power of the government, and protecting individuals.
Exactly. But liberalism has also changed over time, leading to different schools of thought within it, like classical liberalism, which is all about free markets, and social liberalism, which emphasizes social justice and using government to address inequality.
So even within a single ideology, there's a whole range of beliefs and interpretations, right? It's like liberalism has its own family tree with branches growing and sometimes even disagreeing with each other.
Yeah, exactly. And understanding those nuances helps us move beyond those simple labels and really grapple with the complexities of political thought. And it's not just about understanding the other side, it's about understanding our own beliefs too. Learning where our own ideas came from can help us refine our thinking and even challenge our own assumptions.
It's like always being a student, always learning and evolving our understanding of how the world works. I like that a lot. Now, how about conflict? History is full of conflict, right? And this article says that studying those past clashes can help us deal with the political tension we see today.
Well, yeah, conflict is often destructive and painful, but it can also be a force for change. By studying how conflicts started, how they were resolved or not resolved, and what the long-term consequences were, we can learn a lot about power, diplomacy, and just the human cost of conflict.
I remember the article talked about the Peace of Westphalia as an example of how something from history can still be relevant today. That treaty from way back in the 17th century established the idea of state sovereignty, which is still shaping how countries interact today.
It shows us that diplomacy and negotiation, even though they can be frustrating sometimes, are really important tools for resolving conflict and keeping some kind of order in a world where different countries have different interests.
But of course, not all conflict can be solved with diplomacy,
Hmm.
right? Like the American Civil War, as the article mentioned, is this really sad example of how ignoring social injustices and deep divisions within society can lead to terrible consequences.
Yeah, it's a tragic reminder that just wishing problems away doesn't work. Unfortunately, it's a lesson that we haven't always learned.
It's hard to think about all the lives lost and the damage the Civil War did to America. But the article connects this to those more recent civil rights movements, showing that the fight for justice and equality is this ongoing thing.
Yeah, which brings us to the power of those social movements. The article really celebrates how ordinary people can come together and create incredible change.
I love the part about the U.S. civil rights movement. It showed how activists use all sorts of tactics, peaceful protests, boycotts, legal battles, to fight for equality and how they eventually won, like with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's so inspiring to see what they achieved.
It's a story that connects with so many other movements, too. India's independence movement, the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, the fight for LGBTQ plus rights, they all show the power of people coming together to demand change. And it's really encouraging to see how these movements have shaped history and continue to inspire activism today.
It gives me hope that we can continue to build on what they started and tackle the problems we face today.
Totally. Studying these movements helps us understand how they did it, the strategies, the tactics, the importance of being organized. And most importantly, I think it reminds us of the power of hope and working together for a better future.
Now, I want to switch gears again and talk about something that doesn't always get a lot of attention in discussions about politics. Money,
Yeah.
economics. This article delves into that whole complicated relationship between money and politics, and it uses a pretty impactful example.
The Great Depression, right.
Yes. The article talks about how that economic collapse in the 1930s wasn't just a financial crisis. It also had a huge impact on political systems around the world, sparking new ideologies, increasing government involvement in the economy, and even making people rethink the fundamental relationship between citizens and their governments.
Yeah, and in the U.S., the Great Depression led to FDR's New Deal, which, revolutionized the role of government. With social safety nets and economic regulations, a lot of what we have today stems from those years.
And the article connects this to the 2008 financial crisis, too, pointing out that when the economy is in trouble, people crave change. And this can lead to all sorts of political shifts, like those populist movements we talked about earlier, that growing skepticism toward globalization and a renewed focus on economic inequality.
It makes you think, doesn't it? When people are feeling economically insecure, they're more likely to support anyone or anything that promises to shake things up, even if those promises aren't realistic or could even be harmful in the long run.
So understanding the history of economic policies and political movements is super important if you want to understand what's happening in politics today, right? It helps us see how economics affects how people vote, what decisions governments make, and what we're even talking about when we talk about politics.
It all ties together, and it underscores how crucial it is to address economic inequality and support policies that create a fairer and more sustainable economic system. I mean, a healthy democracy needs a healthy economy.
Okay, we've talked about so much already. Revolutions, ideologies, conflicts, social movements, economic crises. I feel like we've touched on everything. But we have to talk about one more big thing: the media. The article takes us through this whole journey of how media and politics have always been intertwined, from those first newspapers all the way to today's digital age.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how media shapes not just how we get information about politics, but also how politicians communicate with us and even how we understand the world.
The article starts way back with newspapers, highlighting how even back then they were super influential in shaping public opinion. It mentions how newspapers helped spread information and rally support for independence during the American Revolution. I mean, can you imagine that? No Twitter, no 24-hour news channels. The power of the printed word must have been incredible back then.
It's a good reminder that people have always craved information, to stay up to date on what's happening and get different perspectives. And throughout history, there's always been new ways to fulfill that need, each with its own advantages and disadvantages.
And then along came radio and television, right?
Yeah.
The article talks about how these new technologies changed everything for politicians. Like those first televised presidential debates in 1960, people say that's when image and presentation became just as important as the actual policies and ideas.
That's the beginning of the whole celebrity politician thing, right? Someone who knows how to work the camera, appear confident and likable, and connect with voters on an emotional level through television.
Yeah, like politics turned into a show. And then, of course, fast forward to today, we have social media, which has completely changed to everything again.
It's such a double-edged sword. On one hand, social media gives politicians the ability to communicate directly with people, to spread their message instantly, and organize movements in ways that were never possible before.
But, as the article points out, social media also creates all these problems with misinformation, echo chambers, where people only see what confirms their existing beliefs, and this incredible amount of polarization. The 2016 U.S. election was a prime example of how social media can be used to manipulate people, spread propaganda, and even threaten the whole idea of democracy. It's pretty unsettling when you think about it.
It's true. It's a completely new landscape, and it requires us to be much more critical of the information we see online. We can't just blindly believe everything that pops up in our feeds. We have to think for ourselves, question our assumptions, and understand that there are all these biases and hidden agendas out there.
So social media is this powerful tool for democracy. But it could also be its downfall if we're not careful, right?
Mhm.
It all comes down to how we use it.
Exactly. And that's something we all need to be talking about and thinking about. It's not just a problem for politicians or the tech companies, it's a challenge for all of us as citizens.
Okay, now I want to shift to one last big idea that the article explores: globalization. It traces this long and complex history of how globalization has changed the world, making countries more and more connected and interdependent. And it turns out this isn't just some new thing. The article even brings up the Silk Road as an early example of globalization.
Oh, yeah, the Silk Road. It wasn't just about trading goods, it was also about sharing ideas, cultures, and political concepts across different parts of the world.
So in a way, globalization has been happening for centuries.
Right. It's always been about the movement of people, goods, ideas, and cultures across borders. But of course, that whole process has really sped up in the modern world.
Yeah, and the article talks about all those international organizations like the UN, global trade agreements like GATT and the WTO, and the explosion of international travel and communication.
All of those things have led to benefits, of course. More trade, economic growth, the spread of knowledge and technology, more opportunities for cultural exchange and collaboration on global issues.
But the article also acknowledges that globalization has come with its share of challenges too, like increased inequality, cultural clashes, and anxieties about national sovereignty and losing local identities.
Yeah, and we've seen those anxieties play out recently with the rise of those populist movements we discussed earlier, the resurgence of nationalism and the backlash against globalization itself. It's complicated, for sure. There are winners and losers.
We've really covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we? From revolutions and ideologies to economic crises and the changing media landscape. It's been amazing to see how all these historical moments have shaped the world we live in today.
It's so important to remember that history isn't just some boring collection of facts and dates. It's a living force that shapes who we are and the world we live in.
Totally. But now I'm wondering, how do we actually use all of this historical knowledge? How do we become more engaged citizens, more than just people watching all of this unfold?
That's the big question, right? It's not enough to just know about history. We need to actively learn from it and apply those lessons to the challenges we face right now.
Okay, so we've spent all this time talking about like the echoes of history,
Mm.
revolutions, ideologies, those economic ups and downs, and how the media has changed over time. But now I'm thinking, how do we actually use all this knowledge to do something? How do we go from just like knowing about history to actually being more involved, more active citizens in the world around us?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, knowing about history is great, but it's what we do with that knowledge that really matters. We need to learn from the past and use those lessons to deal with what's happening right now.
Yeah, totally. But where do we even start? I'm kind of feeling overwhelmed by all this information, to be honest.
Well, I think the first step is to start thinking like a historian. That means always asking ourselves questions like, what are the historical roots of this problem? Are there any patterns from the past that are playing out here? Did people face similar challenges before, and what can we learn from how they handled them?
So instead of just reacting to, like, whatever's in the news today, we should be thinking about the bigger historical picture, those long-term trends that are shaping events.
Exactly. It's like putting on these historical glasses,
Yeah.
so we can see those echoes of the past that are always there influencing our present.
I love that analogy. It's like history is this giant library full of wisdom and insights, but we need to know how to use it, how to find the books that can actually help us deal with the problems we face today.
And the best part is, you don't need to be like a history professor to do this. It's about being curious, asking questions, and looking for different perspectives. Read books, articles, those original documents from the past. Listen to podcasts, watch documentaries. Talk to people who have different backgrounds and experiences than you.
So it's about being an active learner, always trying to understand the past and how it connects to the present.
Yeah, and as we develop this historical way of thinking, we'll start to see the world in a new light. We'll be more aware of how complex things really are, more attuned to how the decisions we make today can affect the future, and better equipped to challenge those oversimplified stories and easy answers that people often throw around.
It's like we're gaining a superpower, the ability to see beyond the surface and understand the deeper forces at work. But as they say, with great power comes great responsibility.
That's a good one. And you're right, it does come with responsibility. As we become more historically informed, I think we have an obligation to get involved in our communities, participate in the political process, and speak up for the changes we believe in.
So it's not just about knowing history. It's about using that knowledge to actually make a difference in the world.
Definitely. Whether it's voting, contacting our elected officials, volunteering, supporting organizations, doing good work, or even just having thoughtful conversations with friends and family about these issues, every action we take can help shape the future.
It reminds us that we're not just passive bystanders in history. We're all active participants in making it. And the choices we make today, even small ones, can have ripple effects for generations to come.
That's so true. We're all part of this ongoing story, this incredible tapestry of human history. And by understanding the past, learning from both the good and the bad things that happened before us, well, I truly believe we can create a better future.
I love that. It's like we're all co-authors of this story, in a way. Okay, I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive into history and politics. But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a question. What connections do you see between the past and what's happening in the world today? And how can understanding history help you create positive change in your own life and community?
That's a question worth thinking about. As we face all the challenges of the 21st century, let's remember that history isn't just some boring subject in school or something we read about in textbooks. It's a source of wisdom, inspiration, and even a call to action.
Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another exciting exploration of the world around us.